Hello, fellow parents and educators. Thank you for joining me at Education Evolution, where we are disrupting the status quo in today's learning models. We talk about present-day education, what's broken, who's fixing it, and how. I'm Dr. Maureen O'Shaughnessy, your host and founder of Education Evolution and the Microschool Coalition, where we are fiercely committed to changing the narrative, to reimagining the education landscape and creating learning that serves all children and prepares them to thrive. If you are new, welcome to the podcast. Please subscribe on our website to get it delivered to your inbox weekly. If you've been around a while, have you left a review? Hi, Kristen. It is so good to have you.
Thank you so much for having me, Maureen. I really, really appreciate it.
And listeners, today I'm chatting with Kristen Miller. After 15 years in schools, she created a youth empowerment organization with the With Heart Project, and we're going to get to hear about it today and how she works alongside schools and districts and promotes social emotional wellness, restorative practices, and positive behavioral interventions and supports. So let's dive into your amazing work. Kristen, I got to watch your video of the inaugural Heart Project you did with your students, with high poverty middle school math students. Your results, their testimonials, oh my gosh, life-changing. Will you tell us the what and why of this experience?
Absolutely. And again, thank you so much for having me. So yes, in my final year in the classroom, I did some informal action research where I, having been in education for as long as I had, saw that there was this huge need for additional social emotional supports and things like what we now know as restorative practices, trauma-informed practices. And so with the permission of my administration, I was able to transform my math classroom into a different kind of a space where every Wednesday we did what was called Wellness Wednesday. And we took a break from math concepts and focused on social emotional wellness type topics. So we started out by getting to know each other, then empathy. We did actual lessons, explicit lessons in these topics: empathy, assertiveness versus aggressiveness, rewriting negative thinking, tools to help students with the things that they're already struggling with. And so with that, I teamed up with my other math teachers, and we were able to get some data to see, after I had taught math quite a bit less than I normally had in prior years. It was typically bell to bell every day, math. And that's what has been the norm for teachers over the last, as long as I can remember. So I teamed up with these other math teachers to compare and see, how did my students do overall? And so it turned out that they ended up outperforming other comparable math students on campus. In one semester, they grew academically 79% in Common Core math instruction, and which it was more on average than the other math teachers' students, even though the other math teachers had focused on math explicitly 99% of the time.
Wow.
So, yeah.
Oh my, that tells us so much about how when we create love and belonging, that it impacts learning and test scores. Was your school able to kind of go wow too, or were you an island?
Well, I was kind of an island that particular year. However, the work that I was doing definitely got the attention of the principal and the social emotional learning director at the district office. And I was asked to be part of the coalition to create the new social emotional learning program within that particular district. However, having conversations with that director, she said, Kristen, you're way out here and this is where we want to go. And the district and, most schools are back here, and there's like a million steps to get from here to there. So where you are is where we're striving to be, but things move at a pretty slow pace in education. So
yeah, no, I don't buy that. I kind of think sometimes the most expedient and right on mode of transportation is a leap of faith. And that's what you took. And we can have excuses and whatnot, but we can also say this is non-negotiable, that our kids feel like they belong. They feel loved and seen and heard. And these are the results we get. So we are making this a priority. So it's kind of a cop out when organizations say we have to move at the pace of the slowest member, instead of how can we create this experience for more kids, and putting kids and their needs ahead of adults and their comfort levels.
I completely agree with you on that. And that's been a very, very big source of frustration for me. I do know, though, having spent time as an administrator, that there is a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of red tape, potential liability, and things that could negatively impact that work, unfortunately.
Right. It's serious work, and it can't be done without the right training and whatnot. And, I just kind of got frustrated. I felt like after a while in administration, I was rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic.
Exactly.
I'm not the best person to talk to, is I'm like, I'm just going to start my own school so we don't have to wait to get everybody on board. It's easier to start fresh than to try and change people that have been doing things a certain way for decades. So I'm probably the wrong person because I rant on that topic anyhow. So let me questions, because I think you and I have some common vocabulary that maybe others don't. So could you describe what are restorative practices and maybe share an example of using one of these?
Sure, absolutely. So I actually was formally trained through the International Institute of Restorative Practices. I was certified as a coach, consultant, trainer, and essentially restorative practices, the definition that IIRP uses is it's an emerging social science to bring communities together. It's essentially a shift in the way that we show up and interact with one another. And I tend to focus on it in the context of schools, clearly, but it's something that can be utilized in everybody's lives in general. One of the most impactful tools, there's a continuum of supports and tools that can be utilized school-wide, but one of the most impactful strategies is what we call formal restorative conferences or conflict resolution circles, where if there is a conflict, or, I've used these in long-time bullying situations, there's essentially this process that we go through where we sit everybody down together in a group. It's a very formalized process. You have to be trained on facilitating this because it's a very, as we talked about early, delicate topic. But we go through and everybody has a chance to say from their perspective what happened with, whatever the most recent event was that brought us together, and talk about what kind of repair needs to be done to make sure that the victim of whatever the situation was feels okay moving forward. And then we come to a set of agreements to make sure that that same kind of incident doesn't happen moving forward. So when I was an administrator, I conducted more of these than I can count, but they're very time consuming. And that's part of why I think it's not utilized as much as it possibly could be. But the transformation that I experienced with my students, with families, with community, with the school through this process was just amazing. I mean, bullying that had been taking place for 2-3 years between the same set of students. After we did this conference, the bullying stopped. I had one student in particular who was struggling with her gender identity and felt that she needed to switch genders, and her parents were very much against it. And so I sat down and had a formal restorative conference with the student and her parents, and we ended up being able to come to a place of acceptance with her parents, and with the school and school district brought a reentry plan in, and she was able to change genders and be welcomed back into the community. And so, yeah, very, very powerful process. That's one example. There's a whole lot more.
Yeah, and it's human to human. And in my ed leadership program, I remember we talked about transactional leadership, which is, okay, you did this, so here's your consequence. Here's the transaction. And what you're doing is transformational leadership, transforming the conversation, teaching new tools, creating solutions that tie back into that situation instead of, oh, you have a detention done, which doesn't heal or change anything.
Exactly. That's exactly it. That's actually what I'm studying. I'm in a transformational leadership doctoral program right now. So,
See, and
yeah,
that was in the 90s, but it's still important stuff. So that's awesome.
definitely. Yeah.
So our micro school has a multi-tiered system of support based on PBIS. Can you tell us about PBIS and the importance of this lens to level the playing field and create equity?
Oh, absolutely. This is a subject that is near and dear to my heart. So, I am of the mindset that we all deserve a fair shot in life. Now, some of us come from backgrounds that make that fair shot much more difficult to achieve. We have a lot of students that come from backgrounds of trauma, and poverty is one of those that is, a persistent area of trauma. But ultimately, we need to have systems of support in place, as you said, to level the playing field. PBIS is one of those. And so positive behavioral interventions and supports. What this does is creates an environment, as we talked about earlier, where kids feel safe, they feel loved, they feel welcomed. So that's tier one strategies that should be utilized by everybody on campus, as far as I'm concerned. When you start getting into tier two and tier three with your students that are potentially at risk, that's when you bring in some other strategies. One of the most important strategies that I utilized in my last year in the classroom was a formalized check-in, check-out system with some at-risk students. And there's some data on my website that shows the difference in various academic indicators or wellness indicators, behavior, discipline infractions, attendance infractions, grade level GPA, and seeing the difference between when they were not involved in this formalized check-in, check-out process, where essentially what it is I was their teacher that they checked in and out with. And every day I would bring them this half sheet of paper that they would take with them to all their classes. And they would have a goal to meet a certain level of points. And if they met their goal within that week, there was a reward there. But they were essentially checking in with me at the beginning of the day and checking out with me at the end of every day. Again, an adult on campus that cared for them and had a genuine care for their well-being. It's another one where the results were amazing. Students' GPAs went up, and in many cases, their attendance infractions went down, behavior discipline infractions went down. So it just goes to show that, again, there's no substitute for having somebody, at least one person on campus that students know is there for them and care about them as human beings first and human doings second. And so that in itself is the power of programs like PBIS and do help level the playing field.
Love that. And I know I've served as the lead on a lot of advanced ad cognia accreditation visits, and it's actually one of their criteria. Does every student have at least one adult that knows that kid and that kid can turn to? That relational piece is non-negotiable. I love that you mentioned human beings first and then human doings. I think we forget, and when we treat them like widgets, the data
Exactly.
shows, it shows when they're treated like humans that they get to blossom. And I love that
Exactly.
you have data. I'm going to go back on your website because I want to review that data. That's so cool. And I'll put all of this in the show notes so people can see your video and see your website. This is great. Trauma.
Yes.
We've used that word a bit in this conversation. I know some people are familiar with ACEs, but I think some people think a trauma is like, oh, something bad happened. Maybe you got mugged and then you move on. Trauma and kids and long-term effects. What can you say about that?
Oh my goodness. This is one that I think is probably the most transformational aspect of the work that I have done, and that I actually recently applied for a grant with ACEs Aware, which is an initiative in California, to create a program where all students are screened, beginning of the year paperwork, all students are screened through schools for ACEs. And then, when we can identify which students have really been struggling, the higher the ACE score, we have a set of interventions partnerships in the community that we can refer them to. We have a medical doctor, we have yoga, mindfulness studios, and mental health therapists. It's really, really important work. But ultimately, yes, there is, I think, some confusion about trauma and what it is. So ACEs stands for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and there has been an incredible amount of research that's been done. Dr. Bruce Perry is a neuroscientist, and that's where I was certified as a trauma-informed practitioner, his Child Trauma Academy. Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, which is now the Surgeon General for the state of California. The two of them have done some really groundbreaking research that shows students or people in general who have been negatively affected by various life circumstances. Some of the ACEs that are out there are things like divorce or alcoholism, substance abuse. Trying to think.
Theirs or family members.
Exactly. Yes. Or a parent that's been incarcerated. These are things that create a traumatic environment for a child at home, to where their brain structure is literally changed in a negative way so that they are not able to learn. They're not able to absorb the academic material that we're expecting them to learn in schools. So in my opinion, in my professional opinion, we are really, really doing a huge disservice to our students, our communities, and ultimately the economy by not addressing this issue. But ultimately, yeah. So there are a set of interventions that exist within trauma-informed practices to essentially help bring kids who have been exposed to trauma back up to their developmental age. Because again, their growth gets stunted by these traumatic experiences.
Absolutely. And I get schools are for education, but I also know we do hearing screenings, that we make sure to provide breakfast before and after care, transportation. Over the decades, we keep adding more supports for students because we're that clearinghouse. In the summer, kids can go and get free lunches at school. So I get some people saying, we have English and math and science to teach. Come on, leave us alone. But schools, and maybe definitely doesn't have to be on the teachers, if agencies and like you said, if you can get grants written and even parents trained, whatever, if we really want to make sure our learners are succeeding, we have to look at them holistically, and we have to understand what ACEs do in terms of attendance, in terms of work completion, in terms of so many things. And we have to use tools to mitigate these disadvantages and traumas to help level the playing field. So kudos to you. And I hope, that our listeners will all be like, oh, that makes good sense. And that we can push together to have ACEs screening and to really get to treat these beautiful children as humans and with empathy for what they bring to school with them.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. Yeah.
Okay, that's a lot of heavy stuff. So now I have a fun final question for you.
Sure.
Okay, so if you had a magic wand and could make some of the magic that happened with you and your 7th grade math students happen on a larger scale, what would you wish for?
Oh, I would wish for money, so that I could essentially take these services and provide them at no cost to schools and districts, and train schools and districts on how to create that environment that will help kids feel safe to allow them to learn the academic material. One of the biggest things that stands in the way for various programs like this is funding. And so that would be my wish, is to have funding to set up systems to support students. That way I could go in and do some training, and then with partners in the community, start rebuilding public education in a more holistic way.
That sounds like starting an education evolution.
Absolutely.
I love it. Yes. And, Kristen, I think that sometimes people think, oh, that soft skill stuff, wishy-washy, we don't really even know if it makes a difference. But you're showing with the data from your seventh graders that this can be data driven, that soft skills and human skills and addressing the whole child doesn't have to be something that you don't know if it's making a difference. You in one semester could measure the difference. So I think the people that are like, oh, that's woo woo, that's fluff. I think you can say, no, I can come in and I can show you. Let's do some before and after. And we have data. And if you're not getting the results, then we don't have to continue, but you will be getting the results. So I don't want people to be dismissive just because it's not a math test or a science assignment that can have this formal grade, that it's not relevant and that it's not quantifiable.
Absolutely. And that was a big push for me. It was a kind of a strategic move on my part. I said, I know how education works. I've been doing this a long time, and nobody will listen unless I have data to back up what I'm doing and that this is where we need to head. And so that was, a big push for me. And I'm so glad that I did. And the data itself has actually opened up a lot of opportunities to help bring this work into other schools. So, yeah.
You are on fire, and pretty soon you're going to have a doctorate under your belt. I can't wait. I am totally having you come back.
Oh, yay.
Us, you're heading places, and we want to hear your journey.
Oh, well, thank you so much. You have the work that you do is so inspiring to me, and I am right there with you. We need an education evolution. I did my master's thesis. Part of the presentation I did was education revolution. We need to rebuild what we have started and make things better moving forward. So
yeah, and it has to keep evolving. Thank you. We're never done. Just like we don't use the same phone we used 20 years ago. We don't do anything that we can't say we've arrived until all of our kids are thriving. And that's going to be a moving target. We have lots of work to do, don't we?
Yes, we do. Yes, we do.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Kristen.
Thank you, Maureen. I appreciate it.
Kristen is a dynamo. I am so pleased and excited when I see younger educators on fire and seeing the whole child, the whole student, and determined to make a difference. So I'm completely inspired by Kristen. Make sure you check out her seventh grade video in the show notes. It's so heartwarming. We know relationships impact test scores. Thinking back to episode 3, John Bergman talks about relationships are foundational and that the flipped learning movement really allows for teachers to spend less time lecturing and more time relating and personalizing. We all know the kids don't care what we know until they know that we care. That makes so much sense to me. Restorative justice, when Kristen was talking about that took me back to early days of lead prep, and high school kids had an open campus, and 2 of our high school kids made an unsafe, just not thinking decision that put them in danger. And we had to close our open campus and kind of see how things turned out. And we have conflict resolution restorative justice circles. And so these 2 high school kids were explaining the bad choice they'd made and why they wouldn't make it again. And they were just in the wrong place at the wrong time, but it was because they weren't thinking. And 6th and 7th graders were like, hey man, well, that's scary. And hey, don't do that again. Okay. And what would have been a consequence for doing something goofy off campus at lunchtime? There's not always a logical consequence, but owning up to what's going on with your community, sorting it out with your community, and making amends with your community. Restorative justice, it was so powerful. And all the kids felt a sense of completion when we were done with our restorative justice circle. So we don't necessarily need a penalty or a punishment when something goes wrong. There are a lot deeper ways, even though it takes more time, really valuable ways to restore the justice. And if you haven't thought of that in your own situations, definitely look up how you might be applying this. It works great in families, in schools, in workplaces, in marriages, all over the place. I also wanted just to go back to the PBIS. I know in episode 8, Julie Burgess Dennis talked to us about the multi-tiered systems of supports, and she helped lead prep create theirs. I just wanted to add that Tier 1 is for every student, and we work hard to work on graphic organizers, executive functioning, empathy and communication, just skills that everybody at Tier 1 needs at our school. But I really liked how Kristen said Tier 1 is making sure that all students feel loved and safe. And I don't think we have that written into our model. It's definitely a priority. So I'm going to go back and check our model, because what's more important than all kids feeling loved and safe? And the topic of trauma, that was really heavy. And I will include Dr. Perry and Dr. Burke Harris's work in the show notes. There's so much data that if a kid has been homeless or seen a parent assaulted or domestic violence or has gone without a meal, there's so much data that this could be making a difference. If this happened before a child was even school age, it could be impacting high school attendance years later. So for us to say we want to understand where kids are when they arrive so that we can really help them move forward instead of just open their heads and dump in that year's academic content, the idea of a screening and really knowing our kids and then having ways to add supports to help those kids that come in at a disadvantage, to me, that's equity. And that's inclusion, and that's acknowledging diversity. That's the DEI that we're not going to get with a nice guest speaker or reading a multicultural novel and discussing it. That's really making a commitment to know the kids that come to us and how to best serve them. So for Kristen to be writing a grant and working on that is very impressive and very important. What a wonderful, inspirational time today. So glad you joined me. If you're finding yourself thinking, I need to do this in my school, let's talk about it. I consult with schools to help them find new, innovative solutions to reaching every student. Let's put together an action plan. Visit educationevolution.org/consult to book a call, and let's get started. Education Evolution listeners, you are the ones to ensure we create classrooms where each student is seen, heard, valued, and thriving. We need you. Let's go out and reach every student today. I'd be so grateful if you'd head over to your podcast app to give a great rating and review if you found this episode valuable. Don't wait. Please do it right now before you forget. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening. Signing off, I am Maureen O'Shaughnessy, your partner in boldly reimagining education.